Hello and welcome to Connections. We're so glad you're with us. When I first started getting to know you, she's like, anger is my favorite emotion. I'm like, I don't know what I'm dealing with here.
We have a shocking new development in the case of former YouTube momfluencer Ruby Franke and her business partner Jodi Hildebrandt, who are both in prison right now for abusing Ruby's children. A disturbing new lawsuit lays out allegations of abuse, coercion, and control against Jodi's company Connexions Classroom, which one ex-client says is a massive scam disguised as life coaching. Welcome to SIDEBAR, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Now, it shouldn't be surprising that Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke, her partner in business and her partner in crime and the abusive control of her children, are facing a lawsuit connected back to Connexions. So there were already concerns swirling about Connexions before Ruby and Jodi were arrested in Utah in 2023. But the horrific abuse that officers uncovered at Jodi's home, that is what really thrust Connexions Classroom into the spotlight. The pair, who were sentenced last year to 4 to 30 years in prison, this all depends upon the parole board, who will eventually have to determine how long they actually spend behind bars. This was after they pleaded guilty to aggravated child abuse. They may be behind bars right now. But according to this new lawsuit that we got our hands on, filed by a former client, Michael Tillman, their alleged abusive and manipulative tactics are still wreaking havoc on clients, even in their absence. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into all of this, everything from this lawsuit. But first, to make sense of what we're going to be talking about, I got to give you a quick refresher in case you don't know the ins and outs of this case. So Ruby Franke, who was once famous for vlogging her family's day-to-day life on the now-defunct YouTube channel 8 Passengers, basically saw her life fall apart. We saw her fall from grace unravel dramatically in August of 2023 because behind the carefully curated images of a perfect family and their perfect family moments was a much darker reality. On August 30th, 2023, Ruby and Jodi were arrested for child abuse after authorities uncovered just the horrific treatment that Ruby's children had endured. Police were tipped off when Ruby's 12-year-old son was able to escape from Jodi Hildebrandt's house. He was covered in open wounds. He was begging neighbors for help. He was emaciated. And when authorities arrived, they found that he'd been bound and tortured with remnants of duct tape still on his wrists. His 10-year-old sister was also there. She was found in a terrible state as well. And we learned in this new lawsuit that the two youngest Franke children, they had reportedly been so isolated that they had even been kept separated from each other in the last few weeks inside of that massive compound. In December of 2023, as I mentioned, Ruby reached a plea deal with prosecutors. She admitted to just a range of gruesome acts of abuse against her children. She did a 180. She did a complete 180 from how she first was talking about Jodi and Connexions. Or if you recall, she wasn't even cooperating with police. She was barely even talking to them in those interrogation tapes. Now, completely different. But she admitted that she forced them to perform physical labor, restricted their oxygen supply, subjected them to cruel and often just bizarre punishments, like making her son stand outside in the heat for hours on end or shaving her daughter's head. Jodi also pled guilty to multiple counts of child abuse, but said during her sentencing, this was unbelievable, that she actually loved the children and never wanted anybody to be hurt. Take that for what you will. Now, in fact, I will tell you, in jailhouse phone calls that were later released, Jodi never really showed any kind of remorse at all for her criminal behavior.
And I don't know if I'm going to be like some kind of example, but when I get out of here, I have a story to tell, and I'm going to try to do everything I can to protect the children, because that's what's happening, is that kids are being just horribly abused.
Hey everybody, this is a Law&Crime legal alert. So recent allegations against the multi-billion-dollar video game industry, they claim that video games are engineered for addiction. Yes, so the claims include trying to make sense of this magical hold that video games seem to have over people, where they just can't put the controller down. Every win triggers a hit of dopamine. That creates a cycle of compulsion, and that disrupts daily life. It harms mental health. Well, our legal sponsors are taking on the industry that has at many times allegedly put profit profit over safety. They're working to potentially get compensation for all of those impacted. So if you or a loved one have suffered physical or mental health issues due to video games, then visit vgclaims.com/sidebar to answer less than 10 questions and check your eligibility to file a claim. Now, the two women's disturbing partnership started several years ago when Ruby sought out a counselor for her eldest son, Chad. This was due to alleged behavioral issues. From there, Jodi also started counseling Ruby and Kevin. Kevin was her husband, Kevin Franke. And she was also counseling their oldest daughter, Shari. But things quickly spiraled out of control when Jodi told Ruby that she had been having these visions. So Jodi actually moves into the Franke house under the guise that Ruby would help care for her. And I'll tell you what, in a recent tell-all book, Shari revealed that her mother and Jodi, they might have been in a sexual relationship during this time as well. Now, at Jodi's insistence, Kevin moved out of the home, isolated him from the family. This was purportedly to save his marriage. Kevin has said that he hadn't seen his children or wife for a year when Ruby was arrested, at which point he filed for divorce. And this now all brings me to the new lawsuit that we're going to talk about. So there is a lot going on, and we won't be able to cover everything in this one episode, but I do want to give you some kind of an overarching view of what this civil action is about. So this complaint was filed in Utah federal court by a man named Michael Tillman, and he is referred to throughout the filing as plaintiff. Here's what we know about him from the lawsuit. So he was married to a woman named McCall Savage, also known as McCall Washburn, because she's now married to somebody else. She's referred to in the complaint as Savage, and the two share a now 10-year-old daughter referred to by the initials EJT. So Tillman is suing his ex-wife, but he's also suing Jodi Hildebrandt, Ruby Franke, and Connexions Classroom LLC under U.S. racketeering statutes, and he's seeking more than $5 million in damages. Racketeering, by the way. We've talked about this before. If you've been following our Diddy coverage, you know exactly what we're talking about. This is a criminal enterprise. I'll expand upon that in a little bit, but keeping that in mind. Connexions, in his mind, is explicitly fraudulent, which he says he didn't fully come to understand until the women were arrested. He claims that Jodi had used the lure of therapy and counseling to trick people into sessions that would eventually morph into a money-making scheme. He says that his wife, at the time, was pulled into what he now believes is a cult. By the way, this is not surprising. This is not unique. Sometimes when there are criminal charges and parties either are convicted or plead guilty, you see a lawsuit right on the back end. So what does his lawsuit say? Well, in part, his lawsuit reads, quote, "In leading Connexions and her other various entities, Hildebrandt relied on several individuals, including Franke, to recruit other members to Connexions and the enterprise and carry out her directives. Through Connexions and the enterprise, defendants purport to offer valuable marital, self-improvement, and group session counseling, classes, workshops, and digital and written materials in exchange for lucrative fees. Through the enterprise, Hildebrandt and other members of the enterprise, including defendants, prey on individuals in vulnerable positions who are seeking legitimate mental health services and indoctrinate members into the enterprise, instructing her associates to perpetuate child abuse, child torture, and psychological abuse on any individual in their lives not deemed to be in what Hildebrandt has coined truth, i.e. aligning with Hildebrandt's will. Under the guise of providing help to those in need, Connexions' fraudulent services are intended to bring individuals under the enterprise's financial and psychological control, entice victims to spend money on fraudulently advertised services which perpetuate and promote child abuse and other illegal acts, encourage psychological abuse, and ultimately break families, all while financially enriching the defendants and further perpetuating the enterprise." Now, we have talked about racketeering. We've talked about the RICO statute before, especially in connection with the Young Thug trial out in Atlanta and the ongoing case against Sean Diddy Combs in New York. Those were criminal cases, but you see it very similar with respect to a lawsuit under the racketeering statute. In those cases, though, prosecutors need to prove that a group of people committed illegal acts in furtherance of this criminal enterprise. This is, again, a civil case, so the bar is lower. It's usually by preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt. But, is it more likely than not that this happened? But Tillman is claiming that Connexions is the criminal enterprise, and the other defendants are doing whatever they can to support it. There are these underlying criminal acts. The lawsuit goes on. The horrific nature of the enterprise was meticulously described by Franke at her criminal aggravated child abuse sentencing hearing. And that's when Ruby talked about how since she'd been separated from Jodi, she was starting to see the light. She was starting to see clear and realized that what she had been doing was wrong.
For the past 4 years, I've chosen to follow counsel and guidance that has led me into a dark delusion. My distorted version of reality went largely unchecked as I would isolate from anyone who challenged me. I was led to believe that this world was an evil place, filled with cops who control, hospitals that injure, government agencies that brainwash, church leaders who lie and lust, husbands who refuse to protect, and children who need abused. My choice to believe and behave this paranoia culminated into criminal activity for which I stand before you today ready to take accountability.
Okay, so how was Tillman himself impacted, right? What's the harm that he suffered? Why is he suing? Well, he is the one who filed this lawsuit, which means the actions of Connexions has to have had some direct and severe impact upon him. And the further we get into this suit, really the worse it gets, because Tillman's complaint says, during their marriage, Savage sought Hildebrandt for routine counseling. Shortly thereafter, Savage eagerly accepted Hildebrandt as her guide and joined the enterprise. Savage and Hildebrandt immediately identified plaintiff as an individual in distortion, upon whom they needed to inflict severe psychological abuse to be brought into truth. Savage masterfully implemented the enterprise's dark teachings to physically abuse and endanger the minor child of Savage and plaintiff and destroy plaintiff's life. So according to Tillman, to this day, his ex-wife is still a devoted follower of Connexions and refuses to acknowledge that Ruby and Jodi's arrests and subsequent guilty pleas are signs of any wrongdoing. And that is really unsettling. That's a really unsettling allegation because you heard, particularly from Ruby, denounce Jodi and her teachings in open court. According to him, that didn't change Savage's views on anything. And by the way, he's alleging criminal conduct here. We do not know if he is cooperating with police in any fashion, whether anyone is under criminal investigation. This is a civil suit. Sometimes you see criminal allegations levied in a civil suit, but remember, statute of limitations issues, different burdens of proof, got to keep it separate. Okay, going back to the filing. Plaintiff pleaded multiple times with Savage to discontinue Savage's implementation of Hildebrandt's methodology with Savage and plaintiff's minor child. Savage refused. Savage continues to engage in criminal and tortious behavior against her minor daughter and plaintiff. And Tillman claims that once his then-wife started having sessions with Jodi, she wanted to pull him into the mix too. So this again is very reminiscent of Kevin Franke and Ruby Franke. Quote, upon information and belief, again that means at this stage of the litigation, once it progresses, I'll have more evidence to prove this. But Hildebrandt and Savage conspired to create the appearance of marital problems with plaintiff that did not exist to recruit plaintiff to the enterprise and induce him to spend money on Connexions, services, and products. During the course of their marriage, Savage spent approximately $5,000 of marital funds on services through Connexions. And within a year of meeting Jodi, again, very eerily reminiscent of Kevin Franke, Tillman says his ex-wife kicked him out. In May of 2016, at the direction of Hildebrandt, Savage demanded that the couple separate. At this time, Savage also unilaterally and unlawfully dictated plaintiff's visitation with EJT, who at the time was around 18 months old. So according to Tillman, he was getting 2 hours of parent time every other day with his then 1-year-old daughter. And he says that eventually changed to 6 hours every Saturday. And he also says that Savage demanded he pay for more Connexions classes or she would divorce him. So after a period where he didn't see his daughter for weeks and Savage was ignoring him, he filed for divorce. Now, again, you could say, how could he do this? How could he let it happen? It's very hard to judge people's relationships, and particularly in this community, with this going on, it might not be so simple. If Jodi Hildebrandt is as persuasive as we heard from Kevin Franke and Ruby Franke, he might have thought that this was for the good of his marriage. Now, Tillman says Jodi was teaching his ex-wife that she must abuse their daughter in order to teach her or help her come into the light. He started documenting this girl's injuries, which over time included a laceration down her entire hamstring, large bruises on her thighs and hips, cuts on her chin and neck, even a bruise around her eye. And why he didn't do anything, you might be asking? Well, Tillman claims that Savage had an excuse every time, saying that EJT had hurt herself when she was unsupervised. Allegations, again, very eerily reminiscent of the Franke situation. The abuse is good for the kids kind of thing. Now, there were also times that EJT would video call her father with evidence of an injury, but Savage would allegedly refuse to take her to the hospital. He also said that he learned later from his daughter that Savage would threaten her or tell her to lie about what happened. Now, the complaint reads, Savage remains a devoted protege of Hildebrandt and staunchly refuses to reject the Hildebrandt methodology of abuse, torture, and pain, even after Hildebrandt and Franke's arrest brought the barbaric nature of the enterprise's fraudulent services to light. According to Tillman, each defendant has engaged in a pattern of wire fraud and therefore a pattern of racketeering activity. Collectively, defendants have engaged in thousands of instances of federal wire fraud. And by the way, when Tillman's attorneys refer to wire fraud, they're talking about not only money that moves across state lines as part of a fraud, but also the perpetuation of that fraud using things like social media pages, podcasts, mailed DVD sets, and more. The complaint even says from May 22nd, 2023 through August 30th, 2023, the time in which Hildebrandt and Franke admitted to this secret torture and abuse of children at Hildebrandt's mansion, they broadcast at least 75 interstate wire communications in the form of podcasts and social media posts from Hildebrandt's compound. Tillman accuses Hildebrandt of hundreds of acts of federal wire fraud dating as far back as 2008. And he believes Ruby committed just short of 300 acts of federal wire fraud during her time with Jodi. Again, nothing to indicate that they're under criminal investigation for this, but this is quite the allegation. So to recap, Tillman says that this alleged criminal enterprise, known as Connexions, is directly responsible for causing his divorce, which subsequently led to contentious custody proceedings. Tillman says he spent more than $100,000 in legal fees just since 2022 and says that EJT has needed more than $2,000 worth of medical care. And on top of all that, around the time that Savage joined up with Connexions, Tillman claims he'd been accepted to several prestigious law schools, but because of everything going on with his personal life, he says he's yet to be able to go back to school, that he's lost job opportunities because of Savage and Jodi's actions. That's really important when you talk about a civil case. What did you lose? What were your lost opportunities, lost wages? So Tillman is asking for at least $5 million in what's known as exemplary or punitive damages, at least. This could go well beyond. And again, this is damages that are awarded to punish a defendant for outrageous conduct, on top of the actual money that Tillman may have lost. And he's also asking for an injunction to be filed preventing Jodi Hildebrandt from selling off any of her assets until the civil case is settled. So ultimately, if he is awarded, if he does win, that judgment can be awarded against him and she has a way to pay it off. But he's also going after, Connexions, and there might be some money there. We'll continue to follow this. We'll continue to break this one down for you. But that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.